Warmly welcome to this seminar at Nordregio. How can we achieve a fair green transition for all? This seminar is a part of a project called Not Just a Green Transition, NJUST, examining the path towards a socially just green transition in the Nordic region. My name is Lisa Pelling. I have been given the honorable task of being the moderator of today's session. I'm a political scientist myself, and I had a think tank called Arena that is based in Stockholm. I have been following this project. Today I will serve as your moderator, and I will hand over for a few opening remarks to Eggert Gudmundsson. Eggert, you are at the Prime Minister's office in Iceland, the leader for sustainable development in the Prime Minister's office, with a quite particular background. You come from the business community. You've been the CEO of some of the leading companies in Iceland in many different parts of the economy. I've listed here the fishing industry, the metal processing industry, high tech and domestic services, as well as, of course, when you're from Iceland, tourism and cultural organizations. And now you are the leader for sustainable development in the Prime Minister's office, and you lead their Sustainable Iceland, which has its role to strengthen and accelerate the cooperation across the government, but also with the business community and other parts of civil society. I hand over to you, Eggert, for a short introduction.
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa, and thank you for this long introduction. I'm speaking here today as the chairperson of this project, the Not Just Green Transition, or NJUST, and I'm very happy to welcome you all to this webinar. We will be discussing some interesting questions today, including how does the green transition impact different social groups and territories across the Nordic region, and how can we implement policies and measures that make sure that the transition leaves no one behind. The events we've seen this summer in the Nordics and in Europe, and of course in the rest of the world, make this topic very important and timely and pertinent today. Here in Iceland, we see very clearly with our own eyes how the glaciers are receding already. That's very visible when you're hiking in the mountains here. So global warming is not a forecast anymore. It's already happening. That's very clear. The NJUST project was initiated and funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers. It runs between 2021 and 24, and is conducted by Nordregio. It has two main objectives. First one is to provide knowledge and information about what just green transition is, and to provide a policy proposal toolbox, if you want, containing information and policies and measures for a just green transition. So what we can do about it, actually. Today in this webinar, we will listen to Nordregio researchers presenting the latest results. One is a survey examining the attitude among the Nordic population towards climate change policies, and how they perceive the element of justice. And the other one is about focus groups results, with representatives from labor unions and interest organizations representing older adults, young people, and people with disabilities. What are their views on a just green transition? Then, together with an expert panel and with you, we will also discuss what should be included in this policy proposal toolbox for a just green transition. So we have a loaded program ahead of us. I therefore won't take more of your time. Welcome you to the webinar and give the word back to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Egert. And before we get on with the presentations, I have a technical remark. Anna Lundgren, who is just standing next to me here, who is the project manager for the NJUST project. She will make sure that we can make this experience this afternoon as interactive as possible by hosting the chat. So please do not hesitate to file your comments, your perspectives, your questions to Anna, to her fellow researchers, and to the panel later on as well. And we'll try to bring your questions into the conversation as often as we can. So please do not hesitate. I would like to remind you as well on a technical note that we are recording this seminar, and it will be posted later on the YouTube channel of Nordregio, so you'll be able to share it with colleagues or other people in your surroundings. You will be sent an email by tomorrow with the relevant links. You would also receive the presentations of that are made in the seminar. But anyway, don't hesitate. You are privileged watching live now, and this privilege consists of you being able to ask your questions straight away to the presenters and to the panel. So without further ado, I will move on to the first presentation, and these are highlights and key results from the survey report In All Fairness, Perceptions of Climate Policies and the Green Transition in the Nordic Region. This report looks like this. You can print it out as I have done, or just access it on the website of Nordregio. And with me here to present this report, I have Carlos Tapia. Please join me up here. Carlos is a senior research fellow at Nordregio. You are specialized in the application of quantitative research methods and statistical learning tools specifically for this issue, for sustainable and inclusive territorial developments. And you have a large research interest, and you worked on a number of projects before, but you have looked into these issues of social vulnerability and transition, and how you can involve local innovation processes as well in this necessary sustainability shift that is ahead of us. You have a PhD in geography from the University of the Basque Country. Please, Carlos, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lisa, for this introduction. As you said, I will be talking today about the perceptions of the Nordic population on the fairness of climate policies. Next slide, please. And the presentation is based on a survey, a representative survey that was run at the Nordic level, including in the 5 Nordic countries and the 3 autonomous and self-governing territories in the fall of 2022. As I said, the survey was representative of the population composition in the Nordic region in each of the countries in terms of age groups and gender distribution. The survey included more than 5,000 interviews. Next, please. With 22 questions in total that included or were distributed in 4 different blocks of questions. The first one looked into the general attitudes towards climate change and climate policies with 4 questions. The second one explored the current effects of climate mitigation policies on individuals and households, and it had 7 questions. The third block looked into the future effects of climate policies on individuals and households with 5 questions. And finally, a very important group of questions for us were on the fairness of climate mitigation policies with 6 questions. Additionally, we also included 14 questions that allowed us to do socio-demographic profiling of respondents so that we could analyze the survey from different angles. Now I will show a teaser of the results on each of these blocks of questions. I have prepared a few visuals, a few plots where I have removed the no answer, no reply options to enhance comparability of results. I have also added some guidance references, straight dotted lines that allow you to compare single results in individual countries or group of social groups with the benchmark, with the total reply rates, and also some arrows that will emphasize the outlying replies. So without further delay, we will start with the general attitudes towards climate change and climate policies. Next, please. So the main finding in this group of questions perhaps is that awareness on climate change is generally high in the Nordic region and is associated with higher acceptance of climate policies. Respondents in Sweden and Denmark are more concerned about climate change and are more likely to agree that more financial resources should be invested in preventing climate change, even if that implies that taxes are raised. Respondents in Finland, the Faroe Islands, and Greenland are less worried about climate change compared to the other Nordic citizens, and together with those living in Norway, are more worried or concerned about the economic and social impacts of climate policies. Next, please. However, the general attitudes on climate change and climate policies are strongly linked to the socioeconomic profile of respondents. In general, men, people with lower educational attainment, those working in carbon-intensive industries, and those living in rural areas are less likely to be concerned or very concerned about climate change, less likely to expect economic benefits from climate action, are more likely to be concerned about potential job losses linked to climate policies. Next, please. So when it comes to the current effects of climate change and climate mitigation policies, we have selected two slides that showcase the main messages in this block of questions. The potential impacts of climate policies on Nordic households are multidimensional, that's clear. So for example, home heating costs is a concern for a small but relevant proportion of the Nordic population, particularly in Denmark and Sweden. Transport costs is more frequent concern across all countries and regions. But most respondents consider that climate policies have a neutral impact on their household economies. Respondents in Sweden, Finland, and Norway are more pessimistic on this point compared to other regions and countries. Next, please. So the living conditions affect people's ability to cope with the impacts of climate policies in general. So for example, people who use cars on high frequency, 5 days per week or more, are more likely to state that climate policies have a negative or very negative impact on their household economies. And those traits are accentuated in rural areas where reliance on cars is higher. Next, please. So let's now move on the following block of questions on the expected effects or impacts of climate policies on households and individuals. Looking ahead, the Nordic population worries that climate initiatives will increase cost of living and prices. So the proportion of those who believe so is highest in Norway, Åland, and Finland compared to other regions, whereas Iceland and Greenland, only 36% and 38% of the respondents respectively expect price increases due to this reason. However, timing might have affected how people replied to this question in particular, because the campaign was run in the fall of 2022 when the inflation peaked due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its effects. Next, please. So again, the socio-demographic profile of respondents affects perceptions on the future impacts of climate policies. Men, people employed in carbon-intensive sectors, people living in rural areas, and those who make more intense use of private motor vehicles tend to have a more skeptical view about the future economic and social benefits of climate policies. So, for example, respondents who work in carbon-intensive industries and sectors are less likely to expect job creation and better working conditions due to climate policies, less likely to think that climate policies improve or will improve health and well-being in the area where they live, less likely to expect changes in lifestyles, in their own lifestyles and their community lifestyles due to climate policies, and more likely to agree that prices and cost of living will increase due to climate policies. Next, please. So let's move on to the final block of questions on fairness of climate change mitigation policies. Next, please. Most respondents in the Nordic region believe that climate policies are unfair from the earnings perspective. In Finland, Sweden, Norway, and Iceland, more than half of respondents share this view. Greenland falls a little bit on the opposite side of the spectrum. 56% of the respondents in that region agree that climate policies are fair from this earnings perspective. Next one, please. And when looking at the issue of fairness from the urban-rural perspective, more respondents in the Nordic region believe that climate policies affect people differently, depending on the type of region where they live, either rural, urban, or intermediate. And this is particularly so in Finland, Sweden, and Norway. And interestingly, the proportion is higher in urban areas compared to rural or intermediate areas. So let's move on to the conclusion section of this presentation, where we will try to highlight a few selected messages on these aspects that we have been exploring in our report. When it comes to the countries and regions, our highlights would be that respondents in Finland and Norway seem to be the most skeptical about the impacts of climate policies. Those in Denmark and Sweden have a greater concern about climate change and therefore have a more positive view on climate policies, even if they will involve personal sacrifices at the household level. Respondents in Sweden and Finland are also more likely to perceive climate policies as unfair on most of the dimensions analyzed in our survey, compared to those living in Greenland or the Faroe Islands, for example. And when it comes to the socio-demographics, our main messages could be as follows. The general attitudes on climate change and climate policies seem to be highly conditioned by the socio-demographic profile of respondents. In general, educational attainment, which is a proxy for personal income, the carbon intensity of the sector of employment, and the degree of urbanization are the three single socioeconomic aspects to be mostly associated with people's perceptions on climate change and climate policies and their impacts. Energy consumption for domestic and transport use seem to affect how people reply to questions related to the current impacts of climate policies on individuals and households, in particular when it comes to the cost of living, which is a logical consequence of fuel costs. And gender and age are also important factors associated with the general attitudes on climate change and climate policies and their perceived fairness, respectively. And with this, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I would be very happy to answer any question that might emerge. But as was first earlier said by Lisa, all the specific answers to the different questions and the results are available on the report that you can download from our website. Thank you.
Yeah, please stay on for
sure.
a while, Carlos, because there are many issues here, and as I tried to say in the introduction, you have worked on these issues for a number of years. You have looked at them from different perspectives. Were you surprised about these results? Had you expected that the socio-demographic factor would be less important? What surprised you when you looked at this material?
Well, perhaps the most interesting finding overall in our analysis is that the fairness aspect was not, after all, as important as we expected it to be. So people seem to reply to the questions more based on their concern about climate change as such, more than about how fair or how, in which way climate policies are actually implemented. We were expecting perhaps to find a bit more of this implementation part, how policies are deployed, affecting then the perceptions on the or the willing to accept sacrifices or to accept or be willing to invest further resources to prevent climate change.
Yeah, and this is despite the fact that the survey was made when the cost of living crisis had started already, right? People were already feeling that they had to pay more to put fuel into their cars or to heat their homes or to pay for groceries in the stores, and still people were not that concerned about the policies being potentially unfair towards them.
They were concerned about that as well,
Yeah.
but they were more concerned. So the mediation effect of this fairness issue is less evident as we expected it to be. In general, the reply patterns are more related to the existing social demographic patterns in the respondents' profiling questions than to the actual thoughts about fairness. But the thoughts about fairness are also conditioned by those socio-demographic aspects. So it's very difficult to analyze and to interpret all these results. They need to be done in a consistent way, taking all these aspects into account at the same time, simultaneously, in order to be. And we are working on that aspect, on this interpretation, multidimensional interpretation issue right now.
There's one question in the chat that says, "I'm surprised by the Finnish findings, normally considered a highly educated society." I'm not sure I want you to answer that specific question, but were there any surprises when you compare the Nordic countries to each other? I thought it was interesting to read about the Icelandic attitudes. It's maybe not so difficult to understand why Icelandic people are less worried about heating costs, for instance, because they virtually are a source of heating, maybe involuntarily too much heating coming out of the ground in Iceland. But the difference that you found between Sweden and Denmark on one side and Finland and Norway on the other side, was that a surprise?
Yeah, to some extent it was kind of surprising. Something interesting that in a way summarizes also the Finnish and the Norwegian case is illustrated by Sweden and the response patterns in Sweden. Essentially what we found in Sweden is that people, even though they might felt that climate policies might be counter-effective or might have an impact on household finances and their own well-being at household level or individual level, they would still be happy to accept increasing efforts to tackle climate change, because on the one hand they were more concerned about climate change as such, and on the other hand they were also expecting to have a more societal benefit from it, not only because of the mitigation of climate change, but also because they were expecting economic benefits at the national level from these policies. So, and this is a pattern that you would not find in Finland, for example. People in Finland were more negative in general, not only were looking or replying at these questions from this household perspective. So they felt that the climate policies might not bring benefits to them directly, but also they thought that in general these policies might not be good for the economy in their countries as well. So, and that is combined with smaller concern about climate change and such. So this is what is eventually driving the reply patterns in the different countries.
This is maybe a too detailed question, but would you think that the last years of investment in the Swedish green revolution and this, the huge investments that we made into the production of batteries and the production of fossil-free steel, do you think that has had an impact on people's perceptions and attitudes, people being maybe a little bit more optimistic about climate change also bringing about benefits for them, not just costs and sacrifices?
It is difficult to say because we did not have any specific question on that topic, on that directly. But what emerges from our survey is that people in the different regions have different attitudes based on also the perceived benefits in their areas. So if these transformations at economic level, industrial level are concentrated in specific areas, it's more likely that those people living in those areas will have a more direct learning from these processes that are of course positive, but also negative, when they are too concentrated in specific areas, because they require a lot of planning and a lot of transformations that affect people's life in those areas. So it's kind of very mixed result and difficult to interpret and to disentangle because it's very multidimensional and there's many aspects that are affecting how people reply to specific countries, sorry, to specific questions. And those could also be very local, very specific, depending on where people live.
Yeah. Let me just, a last question to you is about the socioeconomic aspect. Somehow from this study and from other studies, it emerges a very problematic group of people. Men have spent little time in school, were dependent on their car to transport themselves to job, and who tend to be also working maybe in industries that are directly affected or to say threatened by climate change. Was there a difference in how important this socioeconomic factor was in the different countries? Are other countries in the Nordic region that have managed to better convince this particular male, low education, fossil dependent group of people? Is it possible to say?
I couldn't say that there is a big difference in general in how these aspects emerge in the different countries. So in a way, it's cross-cutting. However, the example that I made before about Sweden could be a good example to explore further, because in Sweden what we see is that even though people might feel that the policies are affecting them negatively, they still support these policies. And that's something unique in Sweden compared to Finland, for example, where most people who think that policies are not beneficial for themselves will not support them. So there might be some differences in this aspect related to what you said before about the socio-demographic profile of people in Sweden compared to other countries.
Okay. Wow, that's extremely interesting, and we will come back to the issue on how to convince this group, how to change the attitudes. When we talked to Nora just now, who has talked to focus groups about this. Thank you so much, Carlos, and as I said before, Carlos' presentation will be emailed to all of you here and be made available, I suppose, at the Nordregio website as well. Now, Nora Sanchez Gassen, you are also Senior Research Fellow here at the Nordregio, a political scientist and a demographer with a research interest in the causes and consequences of population dynamics, among other things. And you have headed the analysis that is targeting people in a conversation. Talking to focus groups is having people just talk, asking them questions, but not in a survey-based, time limited, but just having a conversation with a lot of people. And you have also some very exciting results. So I hand over to you for a presentation.
Thank you, Lisa.
You're welcome.
And we do think so, that they are very interesting. I hope you will agree with me after the presentation. I think we will start with some slides shortly. Yes. So also from me, a warm welcome, everyone. Hello, my name is Nora Sanchez Gassen. As Lisa said, I work as a Senior Research Fellow here at Nordregio, and I'm part of the team, the NJUST team, trying to gain more knowledge about how people in the Nordic countries think about the green transition. So it's my pleasure to tell you a bit about focus group research that we have been doing. And not everyone of you will be familiar perhaps with the focus group concept, but Lisa already explained it. So it's basically moderated conversation, a bit more in-depth conversations about the just green transition that we did. You may wonder why we chose this kind of format. Well, we thought it complements the survey very nicely, because Carlos just told you about the survey results that we gained, and there we get a really broad perspective of how thousands of people in the Nordic countries think about the green transition. But of course, one disadvantage with surveys is that you can never ask a follow-up question. You can never ask why people answered the way they did. But this is something you can dig a bit more deeper into with focus groups, where you can have a more back and forth and discuss certain questions with a bit more depth. So this is what we did, and we hope that this research, or we think that this research complements the survey quite nicely. So we did 4 focus groups in general, and as Egert already said in the beginning, each of those focus groups focused on one particular population group. So we had one focus group looking at unemployed people and those at risk of unemployment, what the green transition means to them. We had one focus group looking at older adults and how the green transition affects their lives. Then a focus group on young people and one on people with disabilities. And our participants in these discussions were organizations representing the interests of those groups. So for example, in the focus group that discussed the issues of unemployed people and those at risk of unemployment, here we talked to labor unions. In focus groups on older adults, for example, there we had interest organizations who represent those groups. And this is all research we did together with our colleagues from the Nordic Welfare Center and also with NFS, a Nordic organization representing labor unions. And we were very grateful for this conversation because it really enabled us to invite the right participants. The focus groups were conducted in the spring this year, and in total we talked to 28 participants from across the Nordic region, really, and we also got some written input from some additional people. In all focus groups, we discussed 3 key topics. We wanted to know from the focus groups participants, on the one hand, what they think are the impacts of the green transition, both positive and negative. And here we, of course, always zoomed in on those population groups that we had in mind. We asked, what are the impacts of the green transition for people at risk of unemployment? What are the impacts of the green transition on older adults? So we tried to zoom in a bit and discuss both the risks and the challenges and also the benefits that may arise. A second theme that we discussed with each focus group was policy recommendations, as we called it. So we really asked the participants what they think should be done to make the green transition more just. If they have any ideas in mind, any suggestions, recommendations, what would help to leave no one behind? And we got some really interesting input there as well, we think. And the third topic that we discussed with each group was involvement and participation, how we can make sure that more social groups can be involved, can have their say, that more people can have their voices heard, how we can best do that. And again, we got some really interesting suggestions there, we think. So now in the following slides, I will share just some of the results that we got. In general, we can say that we got extremely interesting input. We were very impressed by the quality of the discussions and also the quality of the suggestions we received. So I could only pick a couple of examples now for this presentation, but there's much more and we will use it very well for the remainder of the project to formulate recommendations to policymakers. But we can start with the first topic, and that's the discussion of the impacts of the green transition on different groups in the Nordic countries. And as I said before, we try to look both at positive impacts and negative impacts or challenges. When it comes to positives, of course, one very clear impact of the green transition is that if we do it right, CO2 emissions will go down. This will help our environment, will make our air clearer, our water cleaner, etc. And this, of course, has good impacts for our physical health, but also for our mental health. With young people, in the focus group with young people, for example, we discussed that many young people have climate anxiety, are afraid about the future. And of course, for them, seeing visible changes and hearing the things that are being done can help in this process, can give them some new hope. We also discussed, again, with young people, the creation of jobs. New green jobs may appear now in the green transition, and young people think that this is a good effect because it makes really meaningful work to them and may make young people feel like they're contributing to society and not just work for themselves. And in the discussion with labor unions, it was also pointed out that eventually the green transition may lead to lower energy prices, which of course will benefit our populations more broadly. So there were some positive impacts that we identified and also talked about. But perhaps naturally, the discussion focused a bit more strongly on the negative impacts, and we tried to dig a bit deeper there. What kind of challenges, what kind of risks do people see? And here a couple of themes really emerged across the focus groups. Our participants pointed out that there's a risk for increased inequalities in the Nordic countries because of the green transition. And this has 2 dimensions. On the one hand, there's a certain risk, perhaps for increased inequalities between regions. So here we talked to the labor unions, and they pointed out that there might be regional winners and regional losers in the green transition. Some regions that benefit more strongly from the opportunities than others. For example, in Finland, we heard that a lot of wind power will be going to the west of Finland. A lot of investments are happening there, and of course also industries that need this wind power, want to work with this wind power, are moving there. This may benefit Western regions more than Eastern regions. So some of these regional differences we heard about in Finland, but also in other countries. And this also applies, of course, to jobs. There's the expectation that some jobs may disappear in the green transition, others will appear. Some characteristics of existing jobs may change. And there's knowledge emerging on this, on these impacts on the labor market. But when you dig into the detail, regional effects, sectoral effects, effects at company level perhaps, there's still not so much that we know. There's a bit of an uncertainty here that also creates insecurity among people working in specific sectors. And this, of course, has regional implications as well. These risks for increased regional inequality was one side. We also talked a lot about the risk that inequalities may increase across population groups, and that there may also be an increased risk for social exclusion coming from the green transition. And we heard about a lot of very practical examples. I just put 3 examples here, but there were a lot more. Practical examples that are good in general, good trends in general, but may disadvantage certain population groups if not well planned. Digital tools, digitalization was one such tool, one such trend. Of course, digitalization is sort of a separate trend, but it's occurring connected to or in parallel to the green transition. And digital tools, of course, as we heard, for example, in the focus group on people with disabilities, digital tools can be amazing for some people with disabilities and even increase participation chances. But it can also be very difficult for other groups, for example, those with cognitive disabilities or impairments of vision or hearing. So there's this risk that some people may not really be able to participate fully in some new tools. Innovations, we also heard, is one issue. A lot of innovations will happen in the green transition, new services, new products, new tools. Some of them will be, or many of them will certainly be very beneficial, but there's a risk that these reach, for example, people with disabilities last. Because often, for example, with new products, these may have to be adapted so that people with disabilities, certain disabilities, can use them. And those adaptations, of course, often come with a delay. So here you have a risk of really putting people at risk or putting people behind. Electric cars is one such example. We also talked a lot about mobility in the focus group. Of course, this is an area where a lot of changes will be happening. Again, many people or many cities are now trying to reduce car traffic, trying to free up space for people, for green areas, etc., which is a good development. But there's a risk, again, that it may exclude some groups, and these are those that are more dependent on their cars. People with disabilities, older people who can't walk so well. And as we reduce parking spaces in cities, of course, there's a risk that people who can't walk so long, who can't use public transport so easily, they are at risk of being a bit left behind, having it perhaps more difficult to get out and about. So I think in a lot of these cases, we have very good, very positive trends and developments, but we need to think them through to really understand how will they affect different groups in societies, and are there risks that some will be left behind. We also talked about inequalities that are existing right now in people's ability to make green choices. The point here was that even if you're very motivated to change your consumption behavior, for example, to change the way you consume, it may be easier to do that for some people than for others. And this may depend a lot, on the one hand, on finances, which kind of financial background you have, but also on very practical issues. So, for example, buying an electric car can be expensive. If you want to renovate your house to make it more energy efficient, that can be expensive. Some people might take loans, and for example, older people may have a harder time getting such loans. So there are these barriers in between. Also, in the focus group with young people, we discussed regional differences, that the further out you go to the countryside, there may be less sustainable infrastructure in terms of transport, in terms of recycling opportunities, etc. So there are these very practical hindrances that might make it more difficult for some people to choose green than for others. Again, something to think about. Of course, then we didn't want to remain there. We did not just discuss all the challenges, all the risks that are associated with the green transition. We also wanted to know, what can we do about them? So we asked people, what do you think could be done? What could we improve? Do you have ideas for suggestions what policymakers could think about? And again, we got a lot of very interesting suggestions and input. One key theme that emerged as often is that we need more knowledge. We need a better overview of the changes that will happen, how they will impact us on the labor market, in our personal lives, etc. One of the participants in the focus group for young people, for example, urged to always do a generational test right now, so that when we adopt a new policy, we don't only ask what are the benefits and the challenges now, but also always think of what will the impacts be 20, 30, 40 years down the line, to make sure that they are sustainable in the long term. With the labor unions, we discussed a lot the insecurities on the labor market. There's a general expectation that the green transition will have strong impacts on the labor market, and there's also emerging research on that. But as I said, the more you try to drill down on sectoral level, industry level, perhaps even company level, the more unsecure it becomes, the less information there is at the moment on what the impacts may be. And of course, we need to have this knowledge because we also need to plan for reskilling, which will be very important in the green transition. So really creating more knowledge, trying to build, extend the knowledge that we already have, and get into those details will help us prepare, will help us to know what kind of educational offers we will have to make, for example. I said before that we talked a lot about how difficult it can be at the moment to choose green. We also then talked, of course, what can we do to make it easier? What would be some of the solutions that could be adopted so people can more easily choose the green offers that there are? We had discussions on several levels. Financial support is one of them. I mentioned before it may be difficult for some people to make green investments, so some kind of public financial support mechanisms might be needed. And we actually did hear about some good practice examples, for example, from the Faroe. We also talked about how it has to be more convenient to choose green. We had one young person in a focus group that talked about how she personally has to walk quite long to the next recycling bin. And she can do it because she's young and motivated. But a person who has difficulties walking, or a person who does not share the same environmental values, might not do it because it's simply not convenient enough. So on this very practical scale, we talked about how we can make it easier for people in a way to choose green. And again, of course, public transport was a big topic in all the focus group, that we have to expand it. We have to offer more choices for people to use the public transport, leave cars at home. But here again, it's the discussion, how can we make sure that everyone can use it? That was something we discussed, especially in the focus group on people with disabilities. And they pointed out that really one should look more into this, because solutions that benefit people with disabilities often also benefit other people, older adults, for example, parents with a stroller. So really try to think more inclusive to make sure that everyone can be part of this as well. We also talked about communication and education in the focus group. Also, there was a stress that we need to educate, especially young people, but also all of our societies better on the green transition, on how you can make more green choices. We also discussed how you can offer more information, how you can sort of change the communication. In the focus group for older adults, for example, they said that we really should have better communication to the general public of the green transition, about what is being done, the risks, but also the plans. And that this information should be accessible online, but also in other formats. In the group of young people, we talked a lot about how we can change the narrative a little bit, because at the moment, their perception was that the public discussion often focuses on the negatives, on things that become more expensive and more difficult to use, perhaps that will even be forbidden. They said that one idea should be to focus more on the positives. What are the good changes that are coming? Which things are going to be cheaper? How will our lifestyles be better? How will our well-being improve? So to change the conversation, focus more on the optimistic, on the positive parts is one way to go. And then a key message that really emerged, especially in the focus group with labor unions, but also with the young people, is the importance of the Nordic welfare states. With the labor unions, we talked about how they try to motivate their members. They know that a lot of their members may be at risk to lose their job, or may have to re-educate themselves, may have to change how they work. And they try to get their members on board. They try to communicate that the green transition is important, it has to be done, but they also try to communicate that the people should not be afraid, that there's a welfare system to help them, that there will be educational offers so that new chances come up. But some participants in the labor union focus group also told us that they see that the trust in the welfare state is eroding, that people are no longer as trustful that the welfare state will actually help them. So here there was a key message that we cannot erode the offers even further. To the contrary, we have to expand them so people can trust that even in this difficult transition, there is a good future for them. With young people, in a similar way, we talked especially about healthcare services. They mentioned that many young people have climate anxiety, are worried about the future, but it can be very difficult to access help. And if you want to have young people on board, if you want them to be active in the green transition, we need to have these offers, because the green transition and all the changes require energy. So young people should be equipped to participate and do that, and they need help. The last point that we discussed in our focus group concerns how we can improve participation, how we can increase the involvement of different groups, how we can make sure that all our voices are heard. And again, we heard a lot of really good and very concrete suggestions. Here I just put 3 quick examples, but we had a lot more. We heard, for example, about a citizens' parliament that was being done in Denmark, where people, a representative group of the population, developed recommendations for the government for the green transition. We heard that in Finland, youth groups have been started under different ministries who can give their input on topics like the green transition. We also had the recommendation from people with disabilities that perhaps sort of user panel could be created, a group of people with different abilities that test new services, that test new products in the green transition to make sure that everyone can use them. These are just 3 examples, but as I said, there were a lot more very concrete ideas that we will be certain to pass on to policymakers. And in all of this discussion, it was also highlighted that it's important to consider timing, it's important to consider accessibility if you want to increase people's participation. In the focus group with young people, it was suggested, please have offers after work, make it sure that people can participate after their work, make the meetings accessible, or whatever kind of format you want for participation, make it accessible. For some, it works very well to do it digital, not for others, so this would have to be considered. In the focus group with people with disabilities, one key point was that they stress that if they are heard, it often happens way too late in the process. So there was this very strong point that you have to think about when the consultation, when the participation should happen. It has to happen early enough so that when they see concerns, when they see challenges that perhaps no one has thought about, that they can voice them early enough so something can actually be done. And that apparently is not always the case at the moment. And there's a lot of room for improvement. So timing and accessibility as 2 key topics. And to wrap this up, some key messages that we take away now from the focus group is that overall, in all the groups, there was broad and firm support for the green transition. So we could tell that there was a lot of support for this whole process, but there were also worries and risks about some of the consequences, for example, when it comes to increasing inequalities and social inclusion. There was also the impression that we know too little about many of the impacts of the green transition at the moment on the labor market, but also in other areas of our lives. And we saw that there's a very strong interest to actually participate. The organizations that we talked to, they know their members very, very well. They have thought about the green transition, or they have a lot to share, and they're willing to share it. And I think that's something that should be picked up and really, should be encouraged. Overall, we received a lot of ideas, concrete suggestions on how the green transition could be done going further, what could be done to make it more just and more fair for everyone. And it's good material overall for our policy proposals toolbox that we will also discuss a bit later in this webinar, in the panel discussion. Quite briefly from my side already, so you get an idea of what we are aiming to do. In the last 1.5 years of this project, next slide, please. We will create a policy proposals toolbox on request of the Nordic Council of Ministers. What this policy proposals toolbox should be, how it looks like, has not been very well defined, but we know that we're supposed to give recommendations, ideas, suggestions to Nordic policymakers who work with the green transition. What could be done to make this a more just and fair process? And as I just said, we got a lot of very concrete input from the focus group that we can sort of pass on. In addition to sort of passing on these messages, we think that we want to use the research and the material that we've gained so far in the project in the last 2 years. Some of the things that we can do on top is, for example, trying to unpack this concept of justice a bit more, because in different meetings and different conversations, it has become clear that this whole concept of justice and what it means in the green transition, that in itself is very fuzzy and difficult to grasp for different groups. So we could help here. We've done some research on this, and really in very practical terms, not in a theoretical discussion, but in quite concrete terms, try to help and explain how can we work on the different dimensions of justice, what could be done. So just tackling this concept a little bit. Next slide. We could also, of course, we have now quite a lot of information on our different target groups in the project on unemployed people, those at risk of unemployment, older adults, young people, and people with different types of disabilities. We can pass on some of their messages as well quite concretely. What are their worries? What are their concerns? What expectations and ideas do they have? How can we involve those groups better? And then as a third point, we think in the last 2 years, we already heard a lot about different very interesting studies, tools, research that has been developed, which deals with the just green transition. But a lot of this information is quite dispersed. So we can also try to pool this information, have it accessible perhaps in a digital platform. So there's a place for Nordic policymakers who would like to have more information to go and have a look. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention. And especially we want to thank our focus group participants for really sharing their worries, sharing their views, and also sharing all of their really good ideas.
Thank you so much, Nora. And I remind the participants again, you have a privileged position here to ask your questions immediately to Nora as well. I wanted you to clarify one thing just before we start. This group of people that were set up in cooperation with the Nordic Welfare Center, with the Nordic trade unions. So they did consist of people from all of the Nordic region.
Yes, we had participants from all the 5 Nordic countries. Yes. And we also had one participant from the Faroe Islands and one from Greenland. I don't think we had someone specifically from Åland though, but otherwise we tried to be very broad and have in each focus group have all the 5 Nordic countries at least represented.
Wow, yes, very good. And you talked in depth with them. Let me stay on this issue of a policy proposals toolbox, because obviously from a research project like this, you will not come up with ready-made policy proposals, but a policy proposals toolbox. What is a toolbox in this sense? Are you thinking of just listing loads of policy proposals, or are you interested in how policy proposals should be formulated, should be found out? What are your plans?
Yeah, this was let's say it's a very interesting task, but it's also challenging, because what we're aiming to do is to create a toolbox that could potentially be relevant for policymakers in very different sectors. So we're not going to do a policy proposals toolbox for the transport sector or for the energy sector. We want to have a toolbox that could have something meaningful for across, let's say, across sectors. But that, of course, is difficult because we can't dig very deeply. On the other hand, as I said, I tried to say, we got a lot of really interesting and good and very concrete suggestions from our focus groups and from other meetings that we've had. I could only mention a few of them here now. And we think I think we will start with this whole concept of justice, as I tried to say, because the concept of justice is difficult and it has different dimensions. You can talk about a just transition if it involves everyone. You can talk about a just transition if no group in the end is more strongly affected than others. You can talk about a just transition if everyone's rights have been respected in a way. So I think we will start with this concept, just try to clarify what are the different dimensions of this project, of this concept, and then the proposals we got from the focus group actually focus on these different dimensions, so we sort of can group them in this way. And I think our key messages will be, how can we make the whole process more inclusive? How can we make sure, or what are some of the very concrete ideas that would help people in their everyday life, that would sort of be the low-hanging fruits, quite concretely. So I think this is how we will try to build it, but we will have more discussions here today, so perhaps there's going to be other suggestions for us that we will gladly take on board. And I think to make this as accessible for everyone as possible, I think what we will be aiming for is a digital platform, a digital site, so that it's very easy. You don't have to download anything, you don't have to buy anything. It's there. It's there. We will try to see if we can make it happen like that.
From talking to these people in the different focus groups, I suppose you cannot answer all the questions, but was it I want to dig deeper into this issue of justice and the question that we discussed just now with Carlos, the fact that there are certain parts of the population, certain groups, it seems to be more or less the same kind of people with the same demographics, so to say, in all the Nordic countries. They tend to be more male, they tend to have lower education, they tend to be dependent on their cars, they tend to work in sectors that are threatened by the kind of climate transition that is coming and that we have to go through. Is it your perception that the issue of justice is important to this group? Would that trigger them? Would they also feel that the climate transition right now is unjust? Is that an important concept for this group?
It's difficult to say because we did not explicitly discuss this question in the focus groups. What I could perhaps add, and what that relates to this topic, is that especially in the focus group with young people, we talked about the increasing polarization in society, which does not, so basically we have those who are worried of climate change, those who are in favor of strong climate policies, and those who have exactly the opposite views. And one of the key messages that our young representatives were very concerned about is that it's they see a polarization happening among young people, but also in the wider society, where it's not only anymore about climate. There's a lot of other issues as well, LGBTQ rights, for example. A lot of other values come together, and there's a sort of split in society where it's more or less, a polarization happening that cuts across many topics, and where our young people were worried about this process, but at the same time unsure about how it could be addressed. Two things that we discussed in the focus group is on the one hand, when it comes to communication, how we can sort of communicate in a different way, so that it's not anymore about telling people what to do, what they should no longer do, what will become more expensive, but trying to paint the more positive, also highlight the more positive effects that this will all have on all our lives. And the second topic that we have is
so not have this moralizing
no
message,
pointing fingers,
no pointing fingers,
no shaming, highlighting the positive improvements that may happen. For example, if we have more electric vehicles, less dependent on oil, which might also make us less dependent on oil price changes, things like that. So that we try to highlight more the positive impact on people's life. And that could, of course, apply to this group that you mentioned as well. Secondly, we haven't found a perfect answer, but we have discussed how important it is to also see what are the risks and the impact for particular population groups, and how can we target them with policies? So we don't have one policy that applies necessarily to the whole population, because not everyone is always affected in the same way. But how can you sort of get to the nitty-gritty details and support the people who really need it most?
Oh, there are so many issues to be discussed here. I found it very interesting that the focus groups often talked about the welfare state, and this truly is something that characterizes the Nordic regions, that we have strong welfare states with a strong redistribution of incomes across the population, but also strong welfare services, free education, free healthcare, active labor market policy for those that are unemployed, and that the people in the focus group singled out the welfare state as key to achieving a just transition. What about democracy? I would say it also something that characterizes the Nordic regions. We have strong democratic institutions, functioning state of law. Was that a topic that came up in the discussions at all? The threats that are potentially there towards democracy, democratic institutions?
Not explicitly as such as you phrase it right now. As I tried to say during my presentation, we had a lot of discussions about how we can become better at including more people in the conversation, how we can become better at really, as I tried to say, there's so much knowledge, there's so many interesting thoughts and ideas. How can we make sure they're included? How can we make sure they're not forgotten? But also, especially, like I tried to say, that the timing, how can we make sure that everyone is being able to raise their concerns before decisions are already being made? So in this sense, perhaps one could say we try to discuss democracy in the sense of how can we become more inclusive and have more people in part of this process.
And have user panels and citizens parliaments and these kind of tools to really involve people. Extremely interesting. Thank you so much, Nora, for this presentation, and your PowerPoint slides will also be posted on the website and emailed to all of those of you following.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. We will soon move on to the panel discussion, and we have leading experts with us to discuss these issues and further deepen our understanding. But before we do, we will actually listen directly to some of the voices from the focus groups. It's really important to have representatives from particularly vulnerable groups with us and remind us of their concerns and of their interests and their voices. And now, Louise, I hand over to you to switch on the video for everyone. Yes.
People with disabilities are among those who are most severely affected by the consequences of the climate change. We need to make an immediate transition to a sustainable society with measures that promote equality and social justice and fulfill the promise of leaving no one behind. This requires disability-inclusive climate actions. We strongly demand decision makers to involve the disability movement in climate change mitigation and adaptation at all levels. Embrace universal design as a core strategy in transitioning to a sustainable society. the result will be a less fragile society with less need for special solutions. Count on people with disability when planning for the new jobs. Make use of their talents and skills. They are a resource.
I think it's for seniors as in other generations. It's a question of lifelong learning, and it's a question of upskilling of knowledge, both for the senior citizens themselves about how to change their behavior. As older you are, it's more difficult to change your behavior. But it's also about more knowledge for the politicians and the opinion builders about seniors. How do seniors think? How do seniors behave? And go more into the seniors' arenas, so to speak, meet seniors where the seniors are meeting themselves. For instance, in the senior councils, which we have in all the municipalities in Norway, but also I think in Sweden and Denmark, maybe Finland. So the senior councils is an arena where senior citizens meet and where politicians also can meet the seniors.
Well, I think it's very important to have information policies where elderly people are informed about the necessity and what they can do with their own life. For example, short videos which are available is a very important thing. How to change your eating habits from too much meat into more vegetables. And what about the costs? Is that reasonable? What can you do? Being practical and not being too dependent on your taste buds, which has been, well, guiding you all your life on what you want to eat. So that information policy, I think, is important. I would just say, don't forget that the elderly population, 3 out of 4 elderly people live with a chronic disease. Don't forget the services of the welfare society because you are too much engaged in the green transition.
We will have winners and losers within the sectors and also between the sectors. But the main thing is that we have policies that can keep the people with the transition itself. I think we need a lot more social dialogue in the transition, that the social partners can be part of the transition itself. We need a lot more reskilling and upskilling in the transition. We need it because we need the people who can do the transition itself, and we need it so that the people can be part of the transition.
Thank you. Not to continue surfing on YouTube now, but soon you will see a recording of this seminar of the YouTube channel of Nordregio. I'll now switch to a panel discussion, and I find it consists of experts and people who have been working on these issues for many years and from different perspectives. I will introduce all of them, and then I will ask you, John, to start. But I'll do an introduction first. We have John Hastler here, who is a professor at Stockholm University and heads the government inquiry into Fit for 55. John, you are a professor of economics at the Institute for International Economic Studies at Stockholm University. You are also, which is important for all economists here on the panel to know, member of the prize committee Committee for the Prize in Economic Sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, called also the Nobel Prize in Economics. So if you want to show your amazing research results, you have an opportunity to show them now to John. You have worked, John, on different economic issues, but you have targeted as well during the last few years the issue of sustainability and economics. You have also been the chairman of the Swedish Fiscal Policy Council, trying to make sure that the politicians respect the fiscal rules themselves have formulated. From Norway, we have Ellen Bruselius Backer, who is the policy director for the Norwegian 2050 Climate Change Committee. You are, Ellen, working in this committee, and it's a work in progress. You're not ready yet, and there is no final report, a little bit the same situation as John Hassler as well in his government inquiry for Fit for 55. But I hope, Ellen, that you will share some of the insights from the work that you are leading in the Norwegian government offices. And last but not least, we have from Iceland again, Egert Benedikt Gudmundsson from the Prime Minister's Office of Iceland, who is also, I should remember to mention this time, the chair of the NJUST project. So if I turn to you, John Hassler, you have listened to the presentations of this research of the survey and the focus groups. What do you bring into the work that you are now doing for the Swedish government, preparing Sweden for Fit for 55? What kind of perspectives do you find particularly relevant and interesting from these two studies?
Well, I think that what I've heard so far is very interesting and very useful for climate policy in the Nordic countries. So a reflection from what I've heard is that most people seem to be relatively optimistic anyway. I mean, it's clear that we hear about challenges. It's not obvious that the transition will be just. It's not obvious that inequalities is not going to increase. It's not obvious that new jobs will come to the people who lose their own jobs. But I get the feeling, nevertheless, that there is an optimism that this is possible. We can do this. It's not that we have to sacrifice big time in order to deal with the necessary transition. And I think that's a very important message, actually, that we need to put more emphasis on, that it's not necessary to have degrowth. It's not necessary to have a complete change of lifestyle. It's not necessary that lots of people get unemployed. It's not necessary that lots of firms get out of business and are not replaced. That's not necessary. But we have to take the measures that prevent these things from happening. Otherwise, on the other hand, we're not going to have the transition. Then we are going to have too many people blocking it. Mm. So that's my first reaction here. The other thing is that I think it's very timely, this report, in the sense that, you know, economists have, including myself, has for a long time said that it's easy to fix the climate issue. Just introduce either a tax or an emission trading system, a cap and trade, and then deal with distributional consequences by changing the tax schedule or paying some money to the ones that lose. And then it's all fixed. It's obvious that it's not that easy. But it's also obvious to me that these first things, namely the emission trading or taxes that are sufficiently ambitious, are necessary. But now we see with Fit for 55 that these things are introduced at the EU level. So now it's not just targets, it's actually the Fit for 55 implies that we will as long as these rules are not thrown overboard, phase out CO2. It's going to be forbidden to produce steel with fossil fuel after 2039 if these rules are in place. It's going to be forbidden to fly with fossil fuel. So all these things are now happening. So in the sense, what we have asked for, the economists, have now been introduced. But now it's the rest that's so important. So from now, I think climate policy is about making sure that the transition that will happen, as long as these rules are there, will be consistent with people's perception of fairness, with what's economically reasonable, and all these things. And for this, clearly, we need a lot of policies. So climate policy now is industrial policy, it's structural policy, it's educational policy, it's distributional policy, it's regional policy, and all these things that make society continue to work despite this transition. And so I think this what you're talking about is about that. So I think it's very timely.
Yeah. John, just a last question before I turn to Ellen. You have been given a charge from the government that to me seemed almost impossible. Is it that you are reporting already in October on this inquiry?
And it's actually I'm not heading a commission. I am the commission.
You are the commission, exactly.
I don't have a secretariat, and there's no other.
And as you've been pointing out just now, the Fit for 55 is not negotiable. It's not like the Swedish government can say we would like to follow this target or we'll comply with this, but not with other things that has been within the margin of maneuver of national governments. Now the Fit for 55 is. It's the rule. This it has to be done. Do you think that the government is aware of people in general being quite optimistic? The feeling, and I share your impression of the survey and the focus groups, that people are optimistic about this being possible. They're ready to make the transition. They want to challenge their taste buds, as our friends from Denmark just said. Now people are ready to change the way they transport themselves to work, or what they eat, and how they consume. Or is your feeling rather that the politicians are afraid of the people, afraid of their voters, not been willing to make the transition that is needed?
I think politicians are a little bit afraid, yes, in the sense that it's not only that you have kind of a majority with you. There are important groups in society that can block the transition, and we need to bring at least those groups aboard. But then spreading, so focusing on this optimistic side, which, by the way, also goes for policy, I think. So I think when you talk to in particular young people, you often hear them saying that politicians are not doing anything. But that's completely wrong. They are doing a lot. So there should be good room for optimism now. But I in Sweden, I think it's clear actually that too few politicians and too few policymakers, too few participants in the public discussion has been aware of what's happening at the EU level. But now it has happened. And the great thing is also that that's not only targets. If we don't, the thing that comes from EU puts as tough requirements on Sweden as our previous climate law does. It's slightly different, but in general, in the ambition, it's not less. And if we don't fulfill, we are going to be challenged in the European Court. We will
have to pay very expensive fines as well, I've understood. If I turn to you, Ellen Bruselius-Backer, you're Policy Director for the Norwegian 2050 Climate Change Committee. So at least there's a committee, right, that you're a director of, a number of people who are researching, analyzing, preparing this for the Norwegian government. And as I said in the beginning, you are not ready. There's no final report. You're in the middle of the work. What is your perspective on the input that you have been given now with the survey and the focus groups? Are there issues and questions there that you can be useful for you in your work?
Thanks. Thank you very much for inviting us to this very, very timely and interesting webinar. Like John said, I really appreciate both the opportunity to be part of the panel, but also to get a first-hand briefing of the research results. I too think this really illustrates that there has been an evolution in climate policy over the past few years. Before I dig deeper into what I mean by that, I'd just like to point out that I'm not the director as such of the Climate Change Committee. We have somebody else who's that. I'm part of the Secretariat, and it is a big committee of 4. Yeah, it is a big committee of 14 members, just so that's clear. Yes, but like I said, I think this webinar and the research that you presented to us really illustrates that climate policy is about so much more than emissions. I mean, it used to be focused very tightly on emission reductions as such, but we're really understanding now is that it's about society and the evolvement or evolution of our societies. Because as of now, there are so many other very complex issues that we also have to address. And that means that we have to understand climate policies and what are good climate policies in a different perspective. I think having said that, I'd also like to briefly mention that just transition, whilst I think that's important, it's important to note that a just society is also a target in itself. And it's not necessarily the role of climate policy to address everything in society that is unjust. So whilst I certainly see the linkages and recognize that there are discussions to be had, that doesn't mean that it is the responsibility of climate policy, neither mitigation policies nor adaptation policies, to address all difficult things in our society. I think that's a much larger discussion that also has its own set of policy tools related to taxes and housing and education, etc. That's adjacent to climate policies. I have to say, I thought it was very interesting that your respondents so directly pointed to the importance of the welfare state in your discussions with them. I think that's a key strength of the Nordic societies, but also something that we need to keep in mind, that the transition will also require us to keep up the welfare state. So that's an important takeaway for me. And obviously, the policy toolbox, I have to admit that I didn't fully understand how it really will work for policymakers like myself. But if you allow me, I have a few thoughts that I'd like to share, if that's all right.
Yes, please. Go ahead, yes.
Yeah, because one of the things that we've understood during the process of our work with the Commission is that whilst in Norway we have a good time series and very good understanding of our emissions, like Sweden and Denmark and Finland and Iceland, I mean, we all report to the UNFCCC. We have solid inventories for the greenhouse gases. At least in Norway, the information about the emissions profile of various population groups is scattered. It's not consistent time series. It's not linked to the various characteristics of the different population groups. And I think that's something that we need to think about when it comes to just transition, because that means that we're designing climate policies targeting emissions without necessarily having a full understanding of who causes those emissions and what are those emissions linked to in their life. I mean, if I drive my car to work, it's a different source of emissions than if I drive just for fun to my summer house, right? And I think that's information that would be helpful to have when we're talking about a just transition and designing climate policies in that light.
Mm. Thank you so much, Ellen. I think that's a very interesting issue to discuss further as well. Also, these two studies have dwelled a lot about attitudes and people's possibly willingness. But if you talk about the issue in this aspect, you need to ask, Are people driving the car because they like driving a car, or are they driving a car because they have no other alternatives and they hate car driving and would love to take the bus? It's not a question of their attitude or their perspective or their knowledge about the climate crisis. Just there is no bus stop and no services. And I think this is very interesting. Maybe we can come back. And we can ask Nora to join us maybe as well with her perspectives on how the policy proposal toolbox will work, because I think it is targeted at you, Ellen, among others. I think this survey and this and the focus group, this entire research project wants to be relevant for people like you and your colleagues trying to advise the Norwegian government on these issues, and to be relevant, of course, for Jon, who is advising the Swedish government, and to you, Eggert, who are advising the Icelandic Prime Minister. Now, as the chair of this project, you have followed it closely, but still, I ask the same question to you. What perspective, insights, new knowledge do you find particularly relevant from this project and the presentations that we've heard today?
Well, I think maybe some of the most interesting points is how many common themes we see appearing in different contexts, and we're looking at this. We're here in Sustainable Iceland. We're looking at sustainable development. That's kind of where we come from, where the standpoint from which we're looking at things, and of course. The credo or the manifest that's always referred to is the Brundtland Declaration, that we cannot or shouldn't be solving the problems of today by compromising the opportunities of future generations. That is one of the themes that we see appearing also in the now. So we're not only looking at how we're compromising the opportunities of future generations, but how we are compromising the opportunities of other people in the now. And what we've done, for example, here we're developing our strategy here for sustainable development, or a policy document, and one of the things we did was that we had the University of Iceland or the Institute for Sustainable Development at the University of Iceland write or develop a report on the spillover effect, where we're basically looking at the impact we're having on other countries. And the interesting thing there is that we're seeing exactly the same things happening, the same things that you have to think about when you're looking at the impact you have on future generations and the impact you have on current generations in other countries. And in the presentations we just saw, we see a very similar theme appearing, where you're looking at the impact you're having on not on future generations, not on people in other countries, but people in your own country at your own time. And that refers then, for example, to was a good slide there with the impact on people with disabilities, where they were talking about yes, we're having all this progress, we're having all these digital tools, we're having innovation, we're limiting parking space basically to reduce reduce emissions and basically to reduce traffic in general. But the benefits of these they always come last to us. So the benefits of the digital tools come last to the people with disabilities. The benefits of technological innovations comes last to the people with disabilities. So basically you're seeing that these are the same kind of themes appearing in different contexts, and it's all about basically keeping the big picture in mind when you're solving your own problems. Make sure that you're not compromising other people when you're doing that. We know we have to act much faster than we're already doing, we know we're doing way too little and way too late in terms of solving the climate issues. We need to be much more aggressive there and much more aggressive is maybe the right term, because we have been very careful so far. I mean, we've been taking very small steps because we don't want to kind of destroy the economy, and we don't want to do this, and we don't want to disturb anything. We want to be very careful in all the measures we've taken. I think gradually the time for these careful steps will gradually be over. We have to be much more aggressive in our steps because we have to move much faster. And as we are becoming more aggressive, the threat that, or the danger basically, or the risk, let's say, that we in that process will step on other people's toes will be much bigger. So far we've been maybe able to manage things reasonably well, but in the next steps, this will be a much bigger challenge when we as countries and populations start to run faster, as we have to run faster. The challenge to leave no one behind will be much bigger than it has been so far. So I think this is going to be a much bigger challenge in the years to come.
John wants to comment.
I don't know if it's time for that.
Yes,
I'd
no,
like to comment a bit on I get here. I do not think that it's time to be much more aggressive and that we need to move much faster in terms of phasing out the fossil society. I think we have now come to a point where actually we can say that we do this phasing out at a reasonable pace. EU ETS is going to have no emission allowances under the current rules in 2039. The new emission trading system in 2042. I think that's a reasonable pace. It's going to be challenging to do this, but it is a reasonable pace. And now the focus should not be on introducing policies that are even tighter in this respect. The focus should be on making sure that the transition that this will force upon our societies is socially, politically unacceptable to most people in society. Otherwise this is not going to work. I'm not at all worried about that will be unable to put more aggressive demands on the transition. But I am worried that we get resistance to the policies that we have now introduced with Fit for 55. So we must make sure that doesn't happen.
What's your answer to this? What is the target of Iceland? The EU is trying to get Fit for 55 and Norway for 2050. That's what I guess from the name of the climate change committee. Have you set such a deadline for Iceland?
The deadline is to be independent of fossil fuel in 2040. But things are happening very slowly, and that's why I'm saying we have to move much faster, because so far we are not doing anything dramatic. We're doing things in a very soft and cozy way. We're adopting electric vehicles slowly. Actually, Iceland, we always say we are by far the second best in the world after Norway in adopting battery electric vehicles, but that's just not enough, because we're still importing and we're still taking in use vehicles that are burning fossil fuel and will be doing so for years to come. And we sometimes compare what we're doing with of course our reactions to COVID, which was a crisis also. There we were all willing to turn the society upside down for 3 years because of how we want to react to that crisis, and we are not doing anything similar to address the climate issues, which we think is a big crisis as well, if not a bigger one. And so I think we need to do much more and faster. And but I agree that the challenge there will be that we don't destroy the balance in the society, and that's why I think the NJUST approach is very important.
I just wanted to read one comment that just came into the chat. It is Astrid Nilsson Levi's from, I think, Oxfam. Is it, Anna? She writes, the European Trading System, the ETS, covers only 45% of the emissions. The carbon budget to meet the Paris Agreement will be exhausted in 5 years. The fair share of Scandinavian countries, given historical emissions, is to decarbonize very fast. So she seemed to be siding with you, Egert, in saying we need to speed up, we need to do things much faster, whereas John seemed to think that the speed that we are at now will be enough, and the targets that have been set now within the Fit for 55 agenda are enough. But I'll before I let you discuss this, I'll turn to Ellen, because you wanted to come into this conversation as well. What's your perspective?
Yes. Thank you. I think that was a really interesting exchange of views, and I have to say, in Norway, if you look at our the development of our emissions, it's rather flat. I mean, we've reduced approximately 5% since 1990, and which means that we have a fair share to go. And I'm curious, in fact, I'd like to put a question either back to John or an Egert, or also to colleagues at Nordregio, because you didn't mention participation in the EU in your presentations. But I think it's fair to say that EU member states, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, are much more exposed to the development of green policy in Brussels than what we are in Norway and Iceland, even though a fair share of them are in fact EEA relevant. And do you have any thoughts on whether that does influence the views of policies in the population in these countries? I mean, it's a very big difference between our countries, in fact.
What's your perception on that, John? You're now heading or you are the government inquiry, as I should remind people not to. I know you have superpowers because I've read your CV, but still you're just one person. You're advising the government on how to convince the people to follow an agenda that has been decided on the EU level, and that is setting very ambitious targets, regardless of the fact that they might not be ambitious enough. They are targets that will ask of us a quite dramatic transition. But are you optimistic that living in a EU country, the population will accept this, will follow what has been decided in Brussels, will put up with whatever consequences that this transition will entail?
I am optimistic, but that's in a sense perhaps by choice, but also because I think it is possible to do the transition in a way that that people will accept. I don't think it's a necessity that these rules will be thrown overboard, but it requires a lot of policy. Society must continue to work, and people must perceive it to work. And that's a very broad thing. Otherwise, even if a researcher can show that this has nothing to do with some particular climate policies, if people are sufficiently unhappy with the way society works, it's a very big risk that they will blame the climate policies for this. So it is a very big challenge. Fairness is one challenge. It's a key challenge, but there are also other challenges. I just have to say a little bit on the coverage of on the ambition level. The EU ETS covers in the order of half of EU ETS 1, the current EU ETS covers in the order of half of CO2 emissions. less if you include other greenhouse gases. In combination with the EU ETS 2 that's going to be introduced from 2027, more than 95% of emissions are going to be covered when we talk about CO2. And it's CO2 where we can define a carbon budget. We also need to deal with agriculture, in particular methane and NOx, but they are not really included in the CO2 budget, but we need to deal with that too. And if everyone does what we do, we will be close to the 1.5-degree target. We also, and this is about global fairness, we're not talking about that here, but we also in the West have to help developing countries in the transition. So, and I would say that that's particularly Africa. They need help from us in order to do this transition. But giving this help in the way of giving them a bigger carbon budget for the future than we have, that's a very poor help. They do not need to go into a coal-based development strategy and then later on switch to the green. They need to skip that step. And for that, they need financial support, technical support, institutional support, and we do much too little there. So there, we are not in line with the Paris Agreement.
Mm. To making sure, yeah, we breathe the same atmosphere. It's important to remind us that the
otherwise, if we don't
respect
it's not
Nordic borders, and they will not respect any other other borders either. You talked in your introductory remark, John, a lot about economic incentives, about making sure that it is more expensive to emit and making it possible for people to trade emissions and then to cap them as well. What in this policy toolbox that the politicians are now looking into, and that the three of you are charged with advising your governments on, do you think prohibition should play a larger role? Do you think that, Iceland is full of energy? Should you not just forbid people to fuel their cars with fossil fuels in a certain date? In Norway, can you not just forbid people to fly their own helicopters? I know you have people in your populations that are extremely rich, but should you just forbid them private jets? Maybe you shouldn't be allowed. There are many of those proposals also in the Swedish debate. Do you think, speaking also of the fairness perspective, there are some habits that are not a problem for the normal person in retirement or the average young people? They don't fly private jets and they don't drive a very heavy vehicle to work. There are some segments of the populations that maybe also will be more able to protect themselves from the consequences of the transition, the super rich that have consumption patterns and habits of life that are also costing us a much larger share of the CO2 budget. Should we, in the name of fairness, of justice, maybe forbid some of these practices? What do you say, Ellen? Is that on the agenda in Norway, to tell the super rich at the Western Oslo to just chill a little bit and stop destructive consumption?
I wouldn't necessarily phrase the discussion the way that you've done right now, but I'd just like to pick up 2 points that you mentioned. I mean, first, obviously, material consumption levels is part of the discussion in the public in Norway. It's something that we have to look at. Both emissions caused by our import, but also emissions that are related to what Norway exports. Now, the second thing that I wanted to pick up on what you mentioned is the use of what policy tools do we use to achieve our targets. I mean, carbon pricing has been very popular and really the foundation of Norwegian climate policies, but I think we're perhaps seeing that as we understand that climate policy needs to broaden. We also need to make more sophisticated use of the toolbox that we have. That does include legal policy tools like prohibitions, like I'm not sure what the English word is, but the opposite of prohibitions, but also information campaigns, etc. There is a potential there, and I think an interesting discussion there is to what extent do we need to create new norms and new ethical guidelines for our society to become a low emission society? And how does the various policy tools either strengthen and support existing policy tools or existing norms, or create new ones? If we have a carbon price where people can pay to pollute, does that tell people that we don't want carbon emissions, or does it tell them that it's okay to emit carbons as long as you pay? So I think to have a discussion on what do these various policy tools, how do they interact with our society in large is quite an important debate that perhaps we haven't fully taken on board yet.
Thank you so much, Ellen. Egert or John, do you want to comment this aspect? Should prohibition and maybe different policies that are more targeted towards sections of the populations that are maybe particularly over consuming the CO2 budget, is that part of the agenda? Should it be part of the agenda?
Well, the way I see it is that when it comes to CO2, the task is to phase out all emissions of CO2 in a sufficiently fast time. The most easy way of doing that is to have an emission trading system where the amount of emission allowances that enter the market goes to zero. And that's what we now have introduced in EU. So as long as we have that in place, we will be CO2 neutral. Then we have some other things also. We have the, from agriculture and forest, so we need to deal with that too. But when it comes to CO2, including the flying of super rich in private jets, that's going to be taken care of. So there is no direct climate argument for hitting the super rich, in an additional way. It can be if we think that it makes it easier for people to accept the whole system, then maybe we can think of it. So all other policies that kind of facilitate social acceptance, we should need to think about. I think that's hitting the super rich. I don't think that's going to help much in making the transition smoother. But and it's not going to help for climate, so I'm skeptic. But in principle, all these kinds of policies that make for social cohesion, they will be necessary for sure. When it comes to product standards, I think the argument is a little bit different. So, for example, one important product standard that comes in the Fit for 55 is that we will phase out sales of cars using fossil fuel even before the emission trading system comes down to zero. So after 2035, it's not going to be allowed to sell. It's going to be forbidden to sell fossil-driven cars. So that's kind of a product standard that goes to forbids particular technologies. I think the reason there is that it's kind of having both an extra layer of safety in making sure that the industry really shifts direction and makes, otherwise we could be there in 2035 with no electric cars that are efficient and so on, and then it's going to be very difficult to uphold the emission trading system. So as a kind of an additional layer showing where politicians want society to go, I think product standards can be useful.
Thanks a lot, John. What about Iceland, Egert? Are you advising your prime minister to forbid certain consumption patterns or certain cars?
No, so this is luckily I'm not a politician, so I leave this discussion a little bit to or completely to the politicians if it's prohibition or taxing. The question, of course, is what is the most efficient way to move ahead. I still believe that we even though we have ambitious goals, and we have in Iceland, there is the plan is that the import of fossil fuel driven cars will be banned in 2030. So after that, you will not be able to import new fossil fuel driven cars at that time. The reason why I think just intuitively that we can do more, because I think we should do more, and I think we can do more, is that we are currently not really making any sacrifices. The effort we're making now, we're subsidizing, or basically the government is indirectly subsidizing import of electric cars by reducing the import duties on these cars. And this means that people who can afford it, they can buy a Tesla, which would be more expensive if that was not the case. We are not seeing the same progress on the public transport, unfortunately. So we're not seeing that picking up as fast as we would like to see. It doesn't seem that there is a willingness to kind of make those let's say sacrifices. That's a sacrifice, taking a public transport versus driving your own car. So there are still big opportunities that we have to do more things and move faster and getting earlier results. And I think that's definitely something we should aim for. I think the need is there. But if we do it with of course the carrot is normally more effective than the stick. So in this case, I think that's the preferable way. But how the politicians will solve that remains to be seen.
Yes. I think maybe the politicians will get a great help also from the policy proposals toolbox that is now developed by the team of researchers here at Nordregio. I'd like to ask Anna to come back into the picture. Or are you standing there? Just to ask you if there have been any questions. We have had around 70 people looking at this seminar live, and they're representing all parts of civil society. We have trade unionists, we have youth organizations, organization for senior adults. We also have many people that, just like Ellen or yourself, Eggert, are working at the government offices or are charged with doing research and analysis. Are there any questions that have come up in the chat that you'd like to mention, Anna, or to bring into the discussion for the few remaining minutes?
Yes, thank you, Lisa. There's been a lot of comments coming into the chat. Several of the comments have been about terminology. Mm-hmm. What kind of words do we use when we ask about fairness, when we ask questions about, in the survey, for instance, are there room for misinterpretations, and also this concept of justice? Clearly, that was also found out in the focus group. Nora mentioned that there is, we don't know really what is a just green transition. So I think this is something that we can also contribute with in the project, and we have dived into this justice concept a bit and published a report last year about a just green transition. How can we understand this concept that we can develop further now that we move on into the policy proposals toolbox? So several questions about terminology, but then we also now, in the very end, we had two interesting comments and questions, and perhaps that are questions to Carlos and Nora here. Mm-hmm. There is one question about if there are any findings regarding regional variations in the projected transition of workers in the oil and gas industries into green energy jobs. So how are different workers, types of workers, perceiving the green transition? I think we have some results from our survey covering that. And also it's this question, or rather comment, whether the Nordic countries can be front runners when it comes to the green transition. The comment is France, but also Germany talk about going more slowly with green taxes. They're even talking about rolling back some of the taxes. So we will see how far the EU will go, but there's still a need for the Nordics to take a lead, perhaps precisely because we have this expanded welfare state to hold the hand for those hardest hit by the green transition. So perhaps that is something that has come up in the focus groups, whether the Nordics can be frontrunners in this respect. So I move out again.
we have a small table here. Let's see if we can fit the two of you. Carlos, would you want to start with the attitudes and views and perspectives of people who are actually working in the carbon industries, with producing steel or oil? What are there any regional variations in their perceptions?
Well, actually, we did not look specifically about this specific industry, but we looked into what we called carbon-intensive industries, which includes essentially process industry, that is chemical, petrochemical, cement, and other process industries. And what we see there in the survey results patterns is that the people that are working in those sectors are clearly more reluctant to accept the climate agenda in general, which is obvious because they might be more directly affected and their own jobs might be at risk in some ways. But we did not perceive regional differences within this group of people, with the only exception perhaps of Norway versus the other countries. This oil issue is, of course, a sensitive topic in Norway. So understandably, there's more sensitivity towards that among people in that country. But other than this, there's no big differences in the regional response patterns in this respect.
And Nora, the question to you about the Nordic countries being front runners. When you talk to people in the focus groups, these are people that are already involved, right? They are organized in associations, in youth organizations, in associations for older adults, or in trade unions. So I suppose they are the kind of people that tend to be a little bit more enthusiastic. But are they enthusiastic about the Nordics being front runners, doing better than maybe other parts of the world in this aspect?
That's a very interesting question, and I have to smile a little bit because we discussed this precise question this morning in another project. In the focus group, we did not discuss the possible frontrunner roles of the Nordic countries globally. I don't remember that this is a topic that came up explicitly. But as I said this morning in some other project, we discussed this. And there a key conclusion was that here we work together, I should say, with the municipality associations in all the Nordic countries and see what maybe others can learn from our sustainability work. And we know that the Nordic countries, if you have global rankings, we tend to be at the top positions. Yes. That doesn't mean that there's no challenges here. That doesn't mean that things couldn't be done better here. But on the one hand, we do have some good practices, some experience that we can share. Perhaps even more importantly, that was a point we made this morning, perhaps even more importantly is to also share where we have failed, to share where we have challenges, to share where we tried something that didn't work. All of these kind of experiences that we have made in the Nordic countries, and we are ahead in many respects, but there are also things that we should share. So not always just branding ourselves as the best, but also really being humble and admitting this did not work. This is something that is useful for other countries to hear about. So I think these are important points, but no, it did not come explicitly up in the focus group. One thing I wanted to add on in relation to the question of people who work in different industries and regional questions. We do have another project at Nordregio that I just briefly wanted to mention, where we look into the regional impact of the green transition, and we look at one particular industry in each country. And in Norway, it's the oil and gas industry. So we ask, as this industry is going through this transition and has to lower emissions, what might regional impacts be in terms of jobs, for example? Here we don't talk to the people themselves, but we have researchers looking into these potential implications, and that is research that will probably become available in the spring or summer next year. So something where we can also add to the discussion as we go forward.
Yes, you see, I'll move closer to you here. You see from this discussion and from the answers to these questions and from the panel that there's a lot more to be discussed here. There is a lot more studies to come out of this project. It's not finished yet. This is just one milestone of several. So you can have a look at the website of the project to read previous reports and also to stay in touch on the coming reports. In the chat, we will share a possibility to sign up for a newsletter so that you can easily stay in touch with everything that is happening at Nordregio. There are projects concerning climate change and just climate transition, but many other topics that I think are interesting to the people who have been following this seminar as well. It's time for us to close. Thank you so much, Carlos and Nora. Thank you so much, John and Ellen and Eggert at the panel. Thank you, Anna, that is standing behind me, a very humble position for the project manager of this project, have been helping us to make the most out of the chat. Hoping to see you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.